Thank you for that kind introduction. 2 small corrections. Unlike everybody else in the room, I'm actually not a doctor. And secondly, I'm going to deviate a little bit from the title of my presentation. So I'm not going to focus on specific legal challenges or issues, except as they arise as examples in the theme I want to explore with you today. And let me begin by saying I've had the opportunity and the great good fortune to work at the intersection of migration law and healthcare in Canada in a couple of instances. One involved the legal challenge to the cuts to the interim federal health program, which Phil will talk about soon enough, I think. And also, I've had the honor of working with Rachel and others on immigration detention. And I will mention those as I proceed. But what I actually want to do is talk about something I call deservingness. It really should be desert, that would be the proper term, but for some reason in the literature it's known as deservingness, supposedly not to confuse it with something you eat after a meal. But the issue that I want to raise with you is this question of who deserves healthcare? Now, that question, even to pose it to you, I hope, sounds jarring. The idea that some people deserve and other people don't deserve health care, I hope seems dissonant, inconsistent with the commitments that you bring to your role as health professionals. The idea of assessing access to health care according to a moral metric, rather than, let's say, need, or even questions related to the allocation of scarce resources and a utility metric that follows that, isn't, I think, what you were trained to think about. The language of law and policy in relation to healthcare and migration employs sort of technocratic categories like eligibility or ineligibility, entitlement or disqualification, timelines. This kind of bland technocratic language, though, I think masks something else that's going on underneath it, and it's that I want to bring to the surface for you. And it is this idea that somehow some people are eligible, are qualified, because they deserve health care, and other people are ineligible and disqualified because they don't. And that inscribed in our law, in the bland language of eligibility and qualification, is, at least in part, that kind of assessment. And the reason I want to bring it to the fore for you is because I think in Canada and in countries like Canada, we believe that our laws, even if we sort of agree or disagree with specific laws, are predicated on some basic ideas of decency and legitimacy that we sign on to, and that we assume are in place in order, at least in part, to enable us to obey the law without having to know it in detail or question its legitimacy. And so it is that I want to bring to the surface and put out for question in the time that I have with you. And I'm going to use this leitmotif of deservingness in a few ways. And I'm going to start with ideas of deservingness as an allocative principle, as the principle by which one will allocate who gets and who doesn't get health care. Now, a good starting point for that, of course, is the interim federal health program and litigation that arose in connection with it really challenged a regime that used to say this: if you come into the country and you claim refugee protection, you're an asylum seeker, you get roughly the health care that somebody gets if they're on social assistance. And that's been described earlier today. That was changed from the time you make the claim, essentially, to the time you either become a permanent resident because you were accepted, or the time you leave the country. That was changed, and it was replaced with a hierarchy of who gets health care and what kind of health care they get, not according to who needs it or how to allocate scarce resources, but rather it was indexed to who deserves or deserves more to be in Canada at all. Okay. So, for example, People who came as government-assisted resettled refugees got more than people who came as asylum seekers. A pregnant woman from Mexico would get no health care, no prenatal health care, or any health care for that matter, whereas a pregnant woman from Afghanistan would. An asylum seeker who's hit by a car would have access to interim federal health program protection. A refused asylum seeker wouldn't. Okay? So how is all of that being allocated? Well, it's allocated according to an idea of, well, resettled refugees are more deserving than asylum seekers. Now, why would that be? Well, because we get to choose resettled refugees. We pick them. And those we pick are intrinsically more deserving than those who show up at our border and ask for refugee protection. We don't like them. We don't want them. We don't like the way they inflict themselves upon us. Now, let me break that down a little bit further just to say asylum seekers, in fact, do nothing unlawful or even unprecedented in their actions. When Canada signed on to the Refugee Convention, it signed on to a convention that fully anticipated that people would show up at the border asking for refugee protection. That's exactly what it's about. Nevertheless, those people, I think, as you know, are distinguished and disparaged vis-a-vis resettled refugees. So what you get out of this is the idea that access to healthcare is being indexed or calibrated according to a model of deservingness related to our immigration law, not anything related to the need for healthcare. With respect to the woman from Mexico versus woman from Afghanistan, well, the government devised a list of countries that it considered presumptively safe, with the idea that if you are a refugee claimant from one of these countries, we already know you're bogus. And it's really just a matter of going through the routine of having your refugee claim refused. But we're already suspicious of you, as opposed to somebody who comes from a country not on one of those lists. So if you're from a country on a safe list, we're going to deny you health care. If you're from a country where maybe your claim has some credibility to it, you'll get health care. This is all prior to an actual determination of whether the refugee claim is indeed founded or not. So that gives you a sense of what it means to make somebody deserving or undeserving of health care in relation to immigration status. Hannah Arendt, who wrote about refugees and statelessness in the wake of the Second World War in a book called On Totalitarianism, remarked in passing about the treatment of those she called stateless, but today we would call refugees, that in many ways you're better off being a criminal than you are somebody asking for refugee protection. And just to illustrate that principle still lives with us, we would never say, I think, that somebody who has been convicted of a crime and sent to jail is undeserving of health care as a result. Okay? So you can compare somebody who is found to have committed a crime, engaged in wrongdoing, and what kinds of penalties we think are appropriate and inappropriate versus those who come and seek refugee protection. Another example related to that concerns migrants in detention. So Rachel talked about the work of the International Human Rights Program on children in detention. We also did a report on people who are migrants who are being held in immigration detention, but in medium security provincial jails. Some of them are transferred into medium security provincial jails on this basis. They have mental health problems. If they didn't have mental health problems before they were detained, they may well have developed them while in detention. Immigration detention facilities aren't set up to provide meaningful mental health care services. Those people apparently aren't deserving of mental health services, but jails provide them ostensibly. And so migrants in detention who develop or have mental health impairments will be put in jail for their benefit so they can access mental health services. I won't belabor this point to suggest what I think you all know, which is that mental health services in medium security jails are no screaming hell either. So that's what I just want to give you a snapshot of the idea of what it means to say people deserve or don't deserve health care in accordance with their migration status. But let me turn now to talking about deservingness as what I'll call a responsibility shifter. So what work does calling somebody undeserving of health care do to help shift responsibility from the state as the entity that can and ought to provide health services away, sort of to say, we're not responsible for you. Okay? We'll know from the start here that we have seen and heard today about the kinds of physical and mental health harms that refugee claimants endure in the process of trying to flee and get to a place where they can claim refugee protection. Those kinds of harms of transit that expose them to terrific risk. Okay? And I think we heard, for example, about migrants who are trapped in Libya, among other places. Places where they experience profound physical, sexual, mental health harms, right? Those harms of transit happen because we have erected internationally an edifice that does everything possible. Each state does everything it can to prevent refugees from getting here. We expend enormous resources to prevent people who meet the definition of a refugee from ever reaching our border so that they can ask for the refugee protection that we have promised to provide when we signed the Refugee Convention. That's our kind of escape hatch. We promise to provide it if they get here, so we're going to do everything we can to prevent them from getting here. And so the route that people take predictably produces some of the very physical and emotional and other kinds of harms that people who manage to get here present with. Another sort of regime of harm is, of course, the immigration detention itself. So we've heard in particular about the kinds of harms that immigration detention inflicts on children, but frankly, it inflicts various kinds of harms on anybody who is detained. Knowing then how implicated the state is in producing those harms, what does the language or discourse of deservingness do for us? Well, it allows this to happen, and I'm sure you've heard this. If you haven't heard it in Canada, though it's here, you've certainly heard it south of the border. Well, if these people weren't trying to cross the border illegally, they wouldn't be detained, and if they weren't being detained, then they wouldn't experience those harms. It's their own fault. It's their own fault that they are experiencing the harms of detention. It's the parents' fault for bringing children here who end up being separated from them and experiencing the various traumas and harms that go along with that. Right? So the language of deservingness helps shift responsibility away from the state, both for the creation of harm and for mechanisms that can alleviate, minimize, or otherwise sort of ameliorate a harmful situation. Okay. Think about what we've heard about irregular border crossers. Earlier today, you heard about how some irregular border crossers have literally lost fingers and toes from frostbite trying to cross the border. One woman lost her life. Hey, bet you know the response to that, right? Well, if they weren't trying to cross the border illegally, maybe this wouldn't happen to them. It's their own damn fault. Okay, so what you have to know about this is, it's their own damn fault, and if only they lined up in an orderly way, right, that this would not happen to them. So here's a couple of things to know about that. If by by getting in line to wait for resettlement is what people mean, that is, asylum seekers should be waiting patiently in refugee camps to be chosen for resettlement. Okay, know that the odds of resettlement, given the number of refugees in the world, somewhere around 1 in 250. Okay? So the odds of actually being resettled are utterly minuscule. And because, of course, Canada is doing more than other countries with respect to resettlement, it might lead to an understandable misperception in fact, how available resettlement is. But it's really not. Okay? And so if the idea is that asylum seekers should just wait patiently in line, there's no, the odds of resettlement are 1 in 250. If that's the line people are talking about, there's no line at all, really. Alternatively, you might have said, well, they should just go to an ordinary border crossing and then wait in line there so that they don't cross irregularly and so on. Well, the answer to that is they used to do that until 2004. It's the Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement that now makes it impossible for them to do that. It's our actions in making it impossible for them to go to a border crossing that is a regular one that forces them into these irregular crossings, which in turn impose various health consequences on them. Okay. So That's the work that deservingness then does as a responsibility shifter. And the last thing I'll talk about is what I call deservingness as disciplinarian. How does the language of being undeserving authorize the use of healthcare as punishment, or the withdrawal or denial of healthcare as punishment? Well, once you've decided that somebody ought not to be doing what they're doing, they ought not to be crossing the border irregularly, they ought not to be coming to Canada at all as an asylum seeker, they ought not to be overstaying their visa, okay? Then using healthcare as a deterrent rises to the fore as a way to punish them for the audacity of coming when we don't want them or staying longer than we think they should be staying. Now, again, think about this. Think about using healthcare to punish people, right? Again, just to go back, would you think that a just society could ever use denial of healthcare to people convicted of a crime and put in jail? Or would you think that denial of fire services, okay, or denial of police services would be an appropriate way of deterring people from migrating irregularly? That is, if you are a refugee claimant, or you don't have any legal status, and your house is on fire, too bad, okay? Or you are the victim of a crime, too bad. Okay? And yet, that's kind of the story behind the denial of health care as punishment. We see it in, for example, the policy that Canada has, and has had for quite a long time, that denies access to the IFHP for anybody who is a so-called non-status migrant. Okay, so, in fact, quite apart from the changes in 2012, if you are in Canada without status, okay, that is, for example, you've come in on a tourist visa, but you've ended up overstaying and living and working here for several years, you've never had access to the IFHP, and the idea is you shouldn't be here at all, so you can't make a claim on publicly financed health care. Okay. This was recently challenged by going under the United Nations International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Okay. Canada denied somebody named Ms. Toussaint. Some of you have been involved in her case. Was anyone involved in the Toussaint case here? Because she got many of her services from McMaster. Okay, so Nell Toussaint was a non-status migrant. She came to Canada in 1999. She worked till about 2004 or 5. She got sick. She was given kind of health care on the side, but ultimately she was applied for, denied IFHP. She never got IFHP, and the justification that the courts gave was it's legitimate to deny health care to somebody who shouldn't be here to deter that person from staying and to deter others from coming. The Human Rights Committee, the United Nations Human Rights Committee, disagreed and found it to be a violation of Canada's obligations to protect the right to life in a non-discriminatory way. I won't pursue that here. Now, I guess the last thing I'll say is that about how deservingness is used in a disciplinary way, we see in countries like the UK where physicians are being called on, in a sense, to report on patients they see who don't have legal status. So you're being turned into police, as it were. And this is the move that a disciplinary move would have, to, in a sense, deputize everybody as immigration officers. Okay? But there's another move that in Canada, I think you have seen. In the conversations I've heard people say about the IFHP, a lot of physicians dropped out of it when it just became too chaotic, too confusing, and hard to manage, right? And here the government can say something like, well, we're not saying people aren't covered by the IFHP, it's just that doctors don't want to provide it, right? Well, so what happens is that you, through this process of making it so unwieldy and so difficult for you to use, opt out of it with the effect that people don't get the health care they need. And, to say, I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but let me just say, the other day I went to cancel my subscription to a national newspaper. And you know what? You can't do it online. You can sign up for it. You have to call somebody. You have to wait on the phone on hold. You have to lose your number in line and get cut off and call back. It's a hell of a lot of work to cancel your subscription to the Globe and Mail, let me tell you. Okay? And I don't want to sound too conspiratorial, but there's something not dissimilar about how difficult it became to navigate the IFHP in the wake of the cuts made in 2012. This chilling effect then allows you to indirectly, not you personally, to become complicit then in this regime of disciplining refugee claimants who seek health care. Perhaps the last thing I want to say, if I can, is that when health care is allocated or siphoned off according to an idea of deservingness, then we're walking down a road that accepts that some people's suffering counts less than other people's suffering. Some people's lives matter less than other people's lives. And that numbs us to the suffering of others, and from there it's a short trip to just inflicting suffering on others. And I think that's the antithesis of what you as health professionals devote yourselves to. I think a lot of policy, I know that there's a question here about what can we do about policy and what are the issues around that. I think policy can be managed. There are lots of people, myself included, who'd be happy to work on policy initiatives and how to articulate it. But I want to say to you, and particularly to this organization, that what you guys have that a lot of us don't have is a whole lot of moral capital that you can use, and I urge you to use it. Use your moral capital. Tell those stories. Tell stories that resist what is at stake in talking about people not deserving health care, which is the dehumanization of others. Okay? And let me say that we resist dehumanization of others often by trying to tell stories that make those people who are dehumanized superhuman, super accomplished, super successful. And that's a compensatory strategy. Let me say, what I think is really at stake here is not making refugees superhumans, although they are resilient, but they suffer. Some do great, some suffer, some don't do so well. Some are heroes and some aren't. It's really not about making them superhuman. It's letting migrants, refugees, be simply and fully human, just like the rest of us. Thank you.